How many lives can one insult destroy? In the harsh winds of Central Asia, where sands drift like whispers over forgotten cities, a single choice turned an empire to dust. This is not merely a story of conquest. It is the story of total annihilation, of how a single act of arrogance ignited the wrath of a man who would become known to history as the embodiment of unstoppable force, Genghis Khan. In the year 1220, travelers crossing the ancient Silk Road found not the glittering cities of scholars and traders, but landscapes littered with ash and bone. Where once stood the magnificent cities of Merv, Bukhara, and Samarkand, home to towering libraries and bustling markets, there remained only silence and ruin, an entire civilization erased. Few tales in human history capture the sheer scale of destruction and the fragility of civilization like the Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire. This was not a mere territorial war, it was a calculated, methodical erasure. The Khwarezmian Empire, once stretching from the Caspian Sea to the borders of India, controlling the veins of the Silk Road, believed itself untouchable, the rightful heir to the legacies of Persia and Alexander the Great. 10 million souls lived under its banners, confident in their walls, their armies, their learning. But within just 3 years, their empire vanished so utterly that future generations would question whether it ever existed at all. The trigger: a murdered trade caravan, an emperor's pride, a diplomatic insult that shattered the sacred laws protecting envoys. And standing on the other side of the horizon, a force unlike anything the medieval world had ever seen, a force that understood both mercy and annihilation, and chose annihilation with perfect clarity. This is the story of how the Khwarezmian Empire fell not merely to swords and arrows, but to the fury of Genghis Khan, and how one empire's arrogance became a cautionary tale echoing across centuries. Witness the moment when civilization itself stood on the brink, and learn how swiftly an entire world can vanish in the face of the Mongol conquest. To understand how the Khwarezmian Empire fell so utterly before the relentless advance of Genghis Khan and his Mongol invasion, we must first glimpse the blinding heights from which it would plunge. In the first decades of the 13th century, the Khwarezmian Empire rose as a colossus, straddling the arteries of the medieval world. From the turquoise shores of the Caspian Sea to the sun-scorched plains along the borders of India, its banners flew over a realm that commanded the legendary Silk Road, the lifeline of global trade. Gold, silver, and precious gems flowed like rivers through its cities, each coin a silent testament to the empire's wealth and influence. It was a world where caravans carried not only silk and spices, but also secrets, diplomacy, and the whispered rumors of distant thrones. Sultan Muhammad II, the man upon whose shoulders this empire rested, styled himself as the heir of Alexander the Great. In his mind, he was not merely a king, but the embodiment of destiny, chosen to unite vast lands under one scepter. His rule extended across what is today Iran, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and parts of Afghanistan and Kazakhstan. Beneath his dominion lay cities that glowed like jewels in the desert night: Samarkand, Bukhara, Urgench, places whose very names conjured visions of towering minarets, bustling markets, and scholars debating beneath domes etched with calligraphy. The empire's armies seemed invincible, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, composed of heavily armored cavalry, lethal archers, and siege engineers who had crushed neighboring kingdoms with apparent ease. Its fortresses loomed behind massive walls, testaments to architectural prowess and supreme confidence. To outsiders, the Khwarezmian Empire embodied the might and splendor of Islamic civilization, a place where poets, astronomers, and philosophers shaped the currents of thought from Baghdad to Delhi. Its libraries sheltered countless manuscripts on science, medicine, and philosophy, forming a treasury of human knowledge that rivaled the famed collections of Alexandria or Byzantium. Yet amid all this brilliance festered a dangerous flaw. Success had bred arrogance. Power had planted seeds of contempt for anything deemed foreign or barbaric. And nowhere did this arrogance shine more dangerously than in the empire's perception of the rising force beyond the mountains, the Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan. To Sultan Muhammad II and his court, the Mongols were little more than nomadic horsemen whose culture, so it was believed, extended no further than the bow, the spear, and the grazing of animals. They possessed no cities, no libraries, no monuments worthy of civilization. How could such people living under felt tents and roaming vast steppes, possibly threaten a realm that claimed to inherit the glory of Persia and the wisdom of Alexander. And yet, sometimes the walls that appear strongest are built upon illusions. The Khwarezmian court mistook the Mongols' simplicity for weakness. They failed to see the discipline forged in the crucible of the steppe, the tactical brilliance that turned cavalry into thunderbolts of war. The empire sat unknowingly on the brink of total annihilation, believing itself immune, certain that its armies and fortifications could repel any threat. The geopolitical stars appeared to favor the Khwarezmians completely. Only recently had they vanquished the Karakitai, annexing their lands and swelling their coffers. Sultan Muhammad II imagined that these Mongols might serve as useful trading partners, or even as vassals supplying furs and horses in exchange for crafted goods. His pride grew so immense that he dared challenge the supremacy of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, calling himself the second Alexander, convinced he was destined to reign over much of the known world. But pride is the blindfold that history loves to tear away. In quiet council rooms, some whispered that the Mongols were not like other enemies, that they were a force of nature, a storm no walls could hold back. Yet their warnings went unheard, smothered by the Sultan's certainty. The seeds of doom were already sown. And from the east, unseen but unstoppable, Genghis Khan was gathering his legions. The day would come when the merchants of the Silk Road would carry not silks or jade, but tales of burning cities and rivers clogged with bodies. A single empire, once a beacon of wealth and learning, stood on the very threshold of oblivion, and it had no idea how close it truly was. History sometimes turns on a single hinge, a moment so seemingly small that no one notices, until the world begins to burn. For the mighty Khwarezmian Empire, that hinge would creak open in the spring of 1218, when a caravan of roughly 450 men approached the fortress city of Otrar along the fringes of the empire's eastern border. But this was no ordinary gathering of merchants. It was a carefully assembled diplomatic and commercial mission sanctioned personally by Genghis Khan, the rising storm from the steppes, whose name was only just beginning to ripple across the courts of Asia. This caravan bore within its ranks Muslim merchants, Mongol traders, and though historians still debate the extent, likely a handful of intelligence gatherers. In the medieval world, trade and espionage were twins in the same womb. Yet far more valuable than the caravan's vast cargo of gold, silver, furs, silk, and jade was the unspoken message it carried: the promise of peaceful relations between two colossal powers. To ensure the mission would be met with respect, Genghis Khan had deliberately chosen Muslim merchants to lead it, understanding that shared faith and familiar customs would smooth the way. But fate would slip a dagger into this attempt at diplomacy. The man tasked with greeting the caravan was Inalchuq, governor of Otrar and uncle to Sultan Muhammad II himself. He was a man whose heart, it was said, pulsed with equal measures of greed and paranoia. As the caravan presented its credentials and displayed its treasures, Inalchuq saw not an opportunity for alliance, but a chance for plunder, or perhaps the whiff of espionage that could endanger his own standing at court. The decision he made would become the first domino in a sequence leading to catastrophe. Declaring the entire caravan a nest of spies, Inalchuq ordered all its members arrested. Under the hot sun, the merchants were shackled, interrogated, and finally, by explicit decree of Sultan Muhammad II himself, executed. 450 men were slaughtered. Their bodies were left to rot outside the city walls, carrion for the desert winds. The glittering cargo worth a king's ransom was seized and divided among the governor's loyalists, each coin a silent harbinger of the empire's coming doom. And yet this was more than theft, more than mere political murder. In the medieval world, envoys and merchants were sacrosanct, protected under the ancient and near-universal laws of hospitality. To slay a diplomatic mission was to do more than shed blood. It was to tear the unwritten fabric that bound nations, an act tantamount to declaring total war. Inalchuq and the Sultan, lost in the intoxicating glow of power, failed to grasp the magnitude of the affront. They believed the Mongol Empire a distant and insignificant threat, still imagining that the warriors beyond the steppe were little more than a transient cloud of horsemen soon to vanish into the horizon. They could not have been more catastrophically wrong. From the east, the wind carried a single survivor, a lone camel driver who escaped the massacre and rode day and night to the distant court of Genghis Khan in Karakoram. He arrived half-starved, his words trembling with fear as he delivered the story of betrayal and slaughter. The spark had been struck. The flame now spread unseen beneath the fabric of the world. When news reached Genghis Khan, he was said to have retreated for 3 days and nights to a solitary hilltop, speaking to no one, his eyes fixed upon the horizon. Witnesses claimed that when he finally descended, his face bore the stillness of stone and the promise of annihilation. The fate of an empire was sealed in those silent hours. Punchline after punchline has been written about empires falling, but few as chilling as this: a single caravan slaughtered, 1,000,000 lives destined to pay the price. And in the gathering gloom of the steppes, the Mongol horde began to stir a force that understood both the mercy of peace and the precision of extermination, and which at that moment chose the latter without hesitation. Thus began the Mongol invasion that would rewrite the fate of the Khwarezmian Empire and forever redefine what it meant for a civilization to vanish from the chronicles of mankind. It is easy to imagine Genghis Khan as nothing but a creature of fire and blood, a warlord whose shadow darkened half the earth. Yet those who truly study the chronicles of the Mongol Empire know that his wrath, though swift and absolute, was not unleashed without cause. Even as the sands of Otrar drank the blood of his murdered caravan, the great Khan held back the tide of war. For one brief moment, he chose diplomacy over annihilation. When news of the massacre at Otrar reached Karakorum, the Mongol capital, the court fell into stunned silence. Warriors who had spent lifetimes on horseback wept at the violation of sacred custom. For in the laws of the steppe, envoys were untouchable. To kill an ambassador was to declare not simply war, but a war of total destruction. Still, Genghis Khan withdrew to a lonely hilltop, eyes fixed on the horizon, and remained there for 3 days and nights, without uttering a word. Those who glimpsed him described a figure carved from granite, contemplating the weight of vengeance and the price of mercy. And then, in a move that would either stand as proof of his restraint or of his mastery of psychological warfare, he chose diplomacy, a final chance to avoid catastrophe. He dispatched a delegation of 3 envoys to the court of Sultan Muhammad II. Among them was 1 Muslim ambassador and 2 Mongol diplomats carrying a message of stark clarity: return the stolen goods, hand over the governor Inalchuk for punishment, accept responsibility for the deaths of the caravan. If you do this, the matter will be closed. If not, you have chosen war. The message was both a demand and an olive branch. Even at the threshold of rage, Genghis Khan offered the Khwarezmian Empire a path to survival. But pride blinds even the mightiest of rulers. In the marble halls of his capital, Sultan Muhammad II stood surrounded by courtiers whispering of Mongol barbarism, convinced that his empire was too vast, too glorious to kneel before a nomad chieftain. His pride had become a cage, and he rattled its bars with reckless fury. Rather than negotiate, the Sultan chose to compound his insult with an act of calculated humiliation. He ordered the Muslim envoy beheaded, a crime so grave that the blood cried out across continents. As for the 2 Mongol ambassadors, he commanded that their beards be shaved and their faces scarred before sending them back eastward. In Mongol culture, a man's beard was sacred, an emblem of honor and adulthood. To shear it was to brand him in shame for all to see. The envoys staggered back into Karakorum, bloodied and disfigured, their faces twisted with silent anguish. When Genghis Khan beheld them, the silence in the royal court was said to have become suffocating. Hardened generals, men who had ridden through fields of corpses without flinching, were seen trembling with rage. For in that moment, the choice was no longer trade or war. It was a question of honor. Genghis Khan rose and spoke words that would become an omen for the ages. The Sultan has chosen war. Let him have war. Thus was sealed the fate of the Khwarezmian Empire, not through gradual decay, but by a single decision drenched in arrogance. In the eyes of the Mongols, this was not merely an affront to their nation, it was a cosmic crime demanding retribution, a wound that could be healed only through absolute annihilation. Punchlines are often crafted to shock, but none hits harder than the truth: 1 beheaded envoy, 2 shaved beards, an entire civilization destined to burn. And as the Mongol war drums began to beat, echoing across the steppes and swirling dust into the darkening skies, the Mongol invasion gathered like a storm. Soon cities that had stood for 1,000 years would vanish into the silence of the desert wind, and history would record that even the mightiest empire can collapse under the weight of its own pride. So it began the transformation of insult into total annihilation, a tide of blood that would drown cities older than memory itself. With diplomacy shattered, Genghis Khan summoned his generals and unveiled his decision: the Khwarezmian Empire would pay not merely with territory or treasure, but with its very existence. From the snow-lashed steppes to the edge of the Persian sands, word spread like wildfire the Mongol horde was coming. In early 1219, an army estimated between 100,000 and 150,000 mounted warriors began to move westward. But to think of them as merely horsemen is to misunderstand the monstrous precision of the Mongol war machine. Each warrior rode with multiple horses, switching mounts to maintain relentless speed. They carried rations of dried meat and milk curds, able to survive where traditional armies would starve. And above all, they were guided by iron discipline and the ruthless genius of Genghis Khan. Their first target was the city that had sparked it all, Otrar. The Mongols did not simply encircle the walls and wait for starvation to break the defenders. They unleashed a terrifying symphony of psychological warfare. They spread rumors of impossible numbers, sowing confusion. Captured prisoners were forced to march before the Mongol ranks as living shields, their terrified faces warning the defenders of the price of defiance. Inside Otrar, Governor Inalchuk, the very man whose greed and paranoia had doomed his people, prepared for a siege he believed he could endure indefinitely. He trusted the towering walls and massive gates that had repelled lesser foes in ages past. He did not yet understand that the Mongols brought with them not only fearsome cavalry, but also Chinese engineers versed in the secrets of siegecraft and gunpowder. The Mongols assaulted the city in waves, probing its defenses, building siege engines under the cover of darkness. Fires broke out along the ramparts. Stones the size of oxen crashed into the city's towers. Screams of the wounded echoed through narrow streets. The defenders, rattled by the sight of their own captured countrymen forced to approach the walls, began to lose cohesion. After 5 brutal months, the walls were breached. Otrar fell into chaos as Mongol warriors poured through the gaps like a black tide. The streets ran red. Houses were set ablaze, their rooftops collapsing into flaming pits. The air thickened with ash screams and the metallic stench of blood. The same governor who had condemned the caravan to death was finally seized. And here in the charred remains of his city, the Mongols delivered punishment as symbolic as it was horrifying. Molten silver was poured into his ears and eyes, a gruesome retribution for his insatiable greed. Punchlines can be written in ink, but some are etched in molten silver. One man's avarice. A city of 100,000 reduced to silence. The slaughter was methodical, almost ritualistic. Estimates vary, but chroniclers claim that the entire population of Otrar, some 100,000 souls, was eradicated, not merely conquered, but erased. The city itself was razed, its walls pulled down stone by stone, so that no trace of its existence would tempt the desert winds to remember it. News of Otrar's obliteration sped across the empire like lightning through dry brush. In the courts of Samarkand and Bukhara, trembling whispers spread of an enemy who did not ransom cities but exterminated them. Of an army that offered surrender once and, if refused, left nothing but bones and smoke. Thus, the Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire crossed its first threshold of blood. It was no longer simply a war for vengeance. It had become a demonstration to the entire world Genghis Khan would tolerate no insult, no betrayal, and he would ensure that the fate of Otrar became a prophecy for all who thought themselves untouchable behind stone walls. The Mongols departed from the smoking ruins of Otrar not as mere victors, but as executioners carrying the weight of a message written in terror. Total war had arrived, and it wore the face of Genghis Khan. The fall of Otrar was only the beginning. In the wake of its smoking ruins, Genghis Khan turned his gaze toward the beating hearts of the Khwarezmian Empire. His armies surged forward, a tide of steel and hooves determined not merely to conquer cities, but to annihilate the very memory of a civilization. What unfolded next would transform the words Mongol invasion into an eternal warning written across the annals of human history. His next target was the city of Bukhara, a jewel of the Islamic world for over 1,000 years. Bukhara was not merely a city, it was a beacon of scholarship and faith. Its libraries housed countless manuscripts. Its madrasas buzzed with debate. Its markets swelled with merchants from China, India, Persia, and beyond, laden with silk spices and precious stones. In its minarets, muezzins called the faithful to prayer over a city that seemed invincible behind high walls and brave soldiers. Yet Genghis Khan understood that to crush an empire, one must first crush its spirit, and so he did the impossible. Instead of approaching Bukhara along the expected routes, he led his army across the brutal, supposedly impassable Khwarezmian desert. Sandstorms howled, horses collapsed, water skins dried to dust. But when the Mongols finally emerged from the desert haze, they stood suddenly before Bukhara's gates, like phantoms conjured from the sun-baked earth. The psychological impact was devastating. The city's defenders, Turkish mercenaries under seasoned commanders, panicked. On the third day of the siege, they attempted a breakout, only to fall into the Mongols' most devastating weapon, the feigned retreat. The Mongols turned and fled just long enough to lure the garrison far from the walls, then wheeled around and slaughtered them in open battle. Bukhara's gates soon swung open. Civic leaders, trembling, expected the rituals of surrender tribute, a few executions, perhaps an imposed governor. Instead, they witnessed an entirely new kind of conqueror. Genghis Khan entered the city, and standing within its grand mosque, addressed the terrified crowd with words that would echo across centuries: "I am the flail of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." What followed was a spectacle of methodical destruction. Soldiers were executed to the last man. Artisans and craftsmen were spared, but only to be shipped east as slaves, the lifeblood of Mongol conquest. The great mosque of Bukhara was turned into a stable, its sacred halls fouled by horse dung and blood. Libraries were set aflame, centuries of wisdom vanishing into black smoke. Merchants were slaughtered in the streets they once called home. The city was left a gutted husk, its bones visible through walls charred and crumbling. Yet Bukhara was merely the prologue to an even greater tragedy, the siege of Samarkand. This was one of the twin capitals of the empire, the dazzling heart of the Silk Road, defended by a garrison said to number 50,000 men, though some historians suspect this figure was inflated. But no number could stand against the Mongol onslaught. Through spies and prisoners, Genghis Khan knew precisely where Samarkand's walls were weakest, which nobles might be bribed, and how the city could be broken. The siege lasted only 5 days. When the defenders attempted a sortie, they too were drawn into a feigned retreat and butchered outside the walls. Sultan Muhammad II tried twice to send relief armies, only to watch them vanish under Mongol arrows, as if swallowed by the earth itself. On the 5th day, Samarkand surrendered, but Genghis Khan offered no mercy. He ordered every man who had borne arms against him executed despite the city's capitulation, a violation of customary rules of surrender that sent a message as sharp as any blade resistance, no matter how it ends, would be repaid with annihilation. The artisans were spared for slavery. Young men were pressed into the Mongol ranks. The rest faced death or the chains of distant lands. Entire families were ripped apart, treasures looted, and monuments leveled. In less than a week, Samarkand, the shimmering jewel of the Silk Road, was reduced to ash and silence. Punchlines often aim to shock, but sometimes truth alone suffices. 2 cities that stood for 1,000 years fell in less than 10 days. That is the scale of total war. And as the dust settled, a single chilling certainty gripped the empire. If Samarkand could fall so swiftly, no fortress, no wall, no prayer could stand between the Khwarezmian Empire and the storm called Genghis Khan. In the smoking ruin of once great cities, the walls of the Khwarezmian Empire fell not only brick by brick, but piece by piece in the mind of its ruler. As the black banners of the Mongol invasion advanced across Central Asia, Sultan Muhammad II, who had once called himself the Second Alexander the Great, found himself running not as a conqueror, but as prey. He had watched helplessly as Bukhara and Samarkand, the twin jewels of his empire, were swallowed by Mongol fury. His armies shattered, his cities burned, and the roads once lined with caravans now littered with corpses and ash. Even the whispers of courtiers and commanders began to fade into silence, replaced by a single truth echoing through every palace and caravanserai. The Sultan could no longer protect his people. In desperation, he fled westward, accompanied only by a small retinue of loyal followers. Each mile took him farther from the empire he once ruled and deeper into the realm of fear. Meanwhile, Genghis Khan dispatched his two most formidable generals, Subutai and Jebe, with 20,000 horsemen bearing a simple command: hunt him to the ends of the earth. The pursuit that followed was one of the most relentless military operations in medieval history. Subutai and Jebe moved with terrifying speed, crossing rivers, mountain passes, and scorching deserts, covering thousands of miles without pause. Wherever they rode, they spread terror, demanding that every city and village provide information on the Sultan's whereabouts or face the same fate as Bukhara and Samarkand. It was not merely a chase, it was psychological warfare on a continental scale. The sight of Mongol scouts appearing outside city walls, the knowledge that the wrath of Genghis Khan would fall upon any who dared shelter the fugitive Sultan, this shattered whatever loyalty remained. Provincial governors who had once sworn eternal fealty now scrambled to save themselves, making secret overtures to the Mongols or simply abandoning their posts altogether. Sultan Muhammad II, once a man whose word had commanded legions, found himself slipping through snow-choked mountain passes, hiding among shepherds and huddling in the shadows of ruins. His face, once framed in royal turbans and silk, was now pale and gaunt, his breath ragged with sickness and terror. Chroniclers would later write that the Sultan's final days were marked by fevered mutterings, as though he could not comprehend how the empire he believed invincible had crumbled into dust. Punchlines are often written to shock, but sometimes history's own words cut deepest. A ruler who named himself Alexander died not on the battlefield, but like a fugitive, alone and hunted. In December 1220, the man who had dared insult Genghis Khan finally succumbed not to the Mongol sword, but to the quiet, cold hand of illness, possibly pneumonia, on a small island in the Caspian Sea. Some chroniclers suggest the Sultan's true cause of death was not disease, but the unbearable weight of grief and horror at witnessing his world erased. His death marked not just the passing of a monarch, but the symbolic annihilation of Khwarezmian authority. The empire, once boasting legions and treasures beyond measure, splintered into fragments. Cities that had awaited rescue now stood exposed, their gates trembling at the whisper of Mongol hooves. Subutai and Jebe did not pause to mourn. They turned their gaze upon the remaining territories, determined to complete the mission Genghis Khan had set in motion, the total erasure of the Khwarezmian Empire from the chronicles of time. And so ended the tale of Sultan Muhammad II, a ruler whose arrogance unleashed the greatest storm of destruction the medieval world had ever witnessed. His empire had not fallen through slow decline or natural decay, but through one fatal miscalculation. For when he chose to humiliate the envoys of Genghis Khan, he unknowingly signed the death warrant of millions. In the silence that followed his final breath, only one truth remained: even the mightiest rulers can become ghosts wandering the edges of history when they forget the weight of their own mortality. With Sultan Muhammad II dead and the backbone of the Khwarezmian Empire shattered, what followed was not merely conquest, but methodical erasure. The Mongol horde, led by Genghis Khan and his iron commanders, moved like a tide, intent not on ruling, but on wiping clean the map of any trace of those who had dared defy them. The final phase of the Mongol invasion would etch the names Merv, Nishapur, and Urgench into history, not as cities, but as epitaphs for an entire civilization. The city of Merv was the first to stand before this whirlwind. Known to the Persians as the Pearl of the World, Merv had flourished for centuries, its gardens watered by ingenious canals, its markets bustling with scholars and merchants who traced routes from Baghdad to China. It was a place where poetry and science shared the same breath, where the scent of ink and parchment lingered amid spices and silk. When the Mongols arrived in February 1221, Merv's leaders chose surrender, hoping to avoid the fate of Otrar and Bukhara. They opened their gates, offered tribute, and begged for mercy. But by then, Mongol policy had shifted beyond mere punishment. It had become extermination. Genghis Khan had decided that the very memory of resistance must be obliterated. In an act that chills the soul even centuries later, the entire population of Merv, estimated in Persian chronicles at over 1 million souls, though modern historians believe this number smaller was divided into groups. Each Mongol warrior was ordered to kill between 300 and 400 civilians. The killing lasted for days. Pyramids of severed heads rose beneath the desert sun, silent monuments to a vengeance that knew no limit. Houses were looted, libraries burned, and gardens trampled, until Merv ceased to exist as anything but a name on paper. Punchlines sometimes come cheap, but history crafts the cruelest ones. A city called the Pearl of the World reduced to dust in less than a week. The next to face the Mongol storm was Nishapur, a city celebrated as the birthplace of the great poet Omar Khayyam, whose quatrains had once sung of love and the fleeting nature of life. Here the tragedy deepened into personal vengeance. During the siege of Nishapur, a Mongol prince son-in-law to Genghis Khan was killed by an arrow fired from the city's walls. The Mongol response was terrifying in its precision and its fury. The Khan's daughter, grieving and wrathful, took personal command of the retaliation. She ordered that not merely the men, but every woman, child, and even the animals of Nishapur be slain. Chroniclers record that separate pyramids of skulls were built for men, women and children, a macabre catalogue of annihilation. Even cats and dogs were put to the sword, so that, as the Mongols declared, no living thing should remain to mourn the dead. After the slaughter, the Mongols sifted the rubble for hidden survivors. None were spared. The city that had once given the world poetry and science vanished into the blood-soaked soil, its streets now silent, save for the wind whispering through bones. The final act of this dark symphony fell upon Urgench, one of the wealthiest and most important cities in the empire, situated along the life-giving waters of the Amu Darya River. Unlike Merv or Nishapur, Urgench resisted fiercely. Its defenders fought with a desperation born of knowing that surrender meant certain death. For 6 months, the Mongols battered the walls, building siege engines, flooding tunnels, and deploying every tactic learned from their Chinese engineers. When at last the city fell, the vengeance of Genghis Khan was absolute. The Mongols diverted the course of the Amu Darya itself, ensuring that the city could never rise again. Fields turned to marshland. Streets became channels of stagnant water. Urgench ceased to exist, not only as a political entity, but as a living place on earth. By the close of 1221, the Khwarezmian Empire was no longer a realm of scholars, traders, and mighty kings. It was a wasteland scattered with skulls, its once proud cities reduced to legends murmured among frightened survivors. In less than 3 years, an entire civilization had been erased, not simply conquered, but expunged from the ledger of history. And the world learned a lesson written in blood and fire: when you offend Genghis Khan, there is no mercy, no future, only oblivion. When the dust settled over the endless steppes and deserts of Central Asia, the world awoke to a silence more terrifying than the thunder of war. The Khwarezmian Empire, once a titan of power, trade, and learning, lay obliterated under the iron hooves of the Mongol invasion led by Genghis Khan. Yet the true devastation went far beyond toppled walls and slain armies. What died in those short, brutal years between 1219 and 1221 was nothing less than a civilization's very soul. Before the Mongols came, the Khwarezmian Empire was a nexus of culture and commerce. The Silk Road coursed through its cities like veins, carrying the lifeblood of empires. Merchants haggled over silk, jade, and spices. Scholars debated astronomy, medicine, and philosophy under the shadow of turquoise domes. Poets composed verses that traveled from Baghdad to Delhi, carried in the minds of traders and pilgrims. In places like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Merv, the air itself seemed woven from gold and ink. But after the Mongols swept through, that world vanished. The libraries of Samarkand and Bukhara, repositories of countless manuscripts in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, were reduced to ashes. Pages that held the wisdom of centuries floated away on the desert winds. Scholars were slaughtered or carried east in chains. The intellectual currents of the Islamic Golden Age slowed to a trickle, crippled by the loss of both people and places that had nurtured learning. It was not merely cities that fell. It was entire traditions of thought. Economically, the consequences were catastrophic. The Mongols had razed the infrastructure that allowed commerce to thrive. Irrigation systems lay shattered. Canals were clogged with bodies and debris. Trade routes diverted away from once bustling cities, leaving markets silent and streets empty. While the Mongol Empire would eventually re-establish the Silk Road under their own rule, it would never again flow through the same cultural and economic arteries as before. Demographically, the region suffered wounds so deep that they would not heal for centuries. Although medieval population figures remain debated, some sources suggest that up to 90% of the Khwarezmian population perished or fled. Fields turned to wilderness. Towns disappeared beneath drifting sands. The region's recovery was measured not in years but in generations. The psychological shock extended far beyond the empire's former borders. Word of the annihilation of the Khwarezmian Empire reached the courts of Europe, the Middle East, and China. Rulers who had once considered the Mongols merely another nomadic nuisance began to tremble at the thought of a power that could erase entire civilizations. The legend of Genghis Khan became not just a story of conquest, but a symbol of existential terror, a force capable of turning empires into whispers. Punchlines often seek to dramatize history, but the numbers themselves are drama enough. Within 3 years, an empire ruling over nearly 10 million souls became a memory spoken of only in the fearful hush of survivors. Politically, the vacuum left by the Khwarezmians reshaped the entire geopolitical landscape. The Ayyubid dynasty in Egypt and Syria, the Seljuk remnants in Anatolia, and various Persian successor states all maneuvered to claim pieces of the fallen realm. But none could match the scale or ferocity of the Mongols, whose shadow now loomed over every throne from the Yellow River to the Mediterranean Sea. And perhaps the most chilling lesson of all lies in how swiftly the edifice of civilization can collapse. The Khwarezmians were not weak. They commanded vast armies, immense wealth, and brilliant scholars. Their mistake was believing that those things alone could shield them from a force driven not merely by conquest, but by vengeance and principle. Genghis Khan showed the world that total war meant not simply defeating armies, but erasing cultures, histories, and identities. He demonstrated that sometimes the barbarians at the gate are not barbarians at all, but a civilization's final reckoning. In the empty places where Merv, Samarkand, and Nishapur once stood, only shifting sands remain to whisper the truth. Empires can take centuries to build, but only moments to fall. And so, the story of the Khwarezmian Empire becomes a warning echoing down the corridors of time that the arrogance of rulers, the blindness of pride, and the underestimation of one's enemy can doom not merely kings, but entire worlds. And so we stand today, centuries removed from the fires that consumed the Khwarezmian Empire, gazing back at a world turned to ash by the wrath of a single man, Genghis Khan. Yet the shadows of those flames still flicker across our own time, because history's greatest lesson is not merely about kings and conquests, but about the terrifying fragility of civilization itself. We build cities of glass and steel, write codes and treaties, craft laws and alliances, believing that progress makes us untouchable. But the truth the Mongol invasion teaches us is stark and eternal. No empire, no matter how mighty, is immune to the consequences of arrogance, miscalculation, and pride. A single decision, a single insult can unravel centuries of achievement, leaving only dust and silence behind. Punchlines may echo in documentaries and books, but the real question burns deeper. Could it happen again? Could our own modern empires, our global networks, our carefully balanced world fall as swiftly as Otrar, as utterly as Bukhara, as completely as Samarkand? The story of the Khwarezmian Empire reminds us that vigilance is not paranoia. It is survival. That humility is not weakness. It is wisdom. And that the true safeguard of civilization lies not in armies or fortresses, but in the choices we make and the respect we show even to those we think insignificant. So tell me, what do you believe is the greatest threat to our modern civilization? Is it external enemies or the pride that blinds us from within? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about it. Because remembering these stories is the only way we make sure they're never repeated. And if you found this journey through the rise and annihilation of the Khwarezmian Empire as chilling and eye-opening as I did, don't forget to hit subscribe, save this video to your history, and share it with others who love the secrets of the past. This is not just history, it's the warning echoing through time. And together, we're here to uncover it.